So today we will take a look at learning theories in the field of education. And we see that in the field of education, understanding how learning occurs is very important, especially when it comes to making strategies and at the same time for effective teaching. Now, this understanding is also rooted in the understanding of learning theories. And it is said that these learning theories they in a way offer insights especially into the way how individuals acquire, process as well as retain knowledge. Now, learning theories are not just abstract ideas, but they are foundational principles that influence every aspect of learning and teaching. Now, this is right from the curriculum design, right up to the classroom management. And therefore, in the context of philosophy of education, we see that these learning theories serve as guiding frameworks which help educators make informed decisions and also to see how best to facilitate learning. Now, philosophy of education will explore the underlying principles and values that shape our educational practices and learning theories, and at the same time it provides tools and concepts that are needed to apply these philosophical ideas in practical real world settings. So let's take for example, there is a teacher who wants to help students to grasp mathematical concepts. Now, depending on the teacher's understanding of learning theories, the teacher might choose different approaches. So, if a teacher is influenced by Constructivism, then we see that the teacher might create hands-on activities that allow students to explore mathematical ideas through experimentation as well as discovery. On the other hand, if a teacher adheres to associationist theory, then we see that the teacher will try to make the students to memorize formulas through repetition. And therefore, understanding these theories will help us in order to tailor the portion or to tailor the syllabus according to the needs of the students and also according to the goals of the education system. And therefore, today we shall explore 4 key learning theories, which have significantly, in a way, influenced educational practices. Now, which are they? First is associationism. Now, this theory emphasizes the role of forming associations between stimuli as well as responses. So this was one of the earliest theories of learning, and in a way it highlights the importance of repetition as well as reinforcement. Now next is constructivism. This suggests that learners actively construct their understanding and knowledge through experiences and reflection. So here we see that the role of experience and reflection is quite important, and therefore it emphasizes that the role of the learner as an active participant in the whole learning process. Now next is the problem solving theory. Now this theory will in a way focus on the cognitive processes that are involved in identifying, analyzing and solving problems, and therefore it highlights the importance of critical thinking as well as reflective thought in learning. And next is connectionism. This basically explains learning as the formation of connections between stimuli and responses, but often through trial and error. So it emphasizes the gradual strengthening of correct responses by trial and error, by practice and by reinforcement. So we see that by the end of this, we should have a clear understanding how each of these theories views the learner's role, the process of learning, as well as the teacher's role. And therefore this knowledge will help us in a way to critically evaluate different educational approaches and also to apply them in ways that best support the student learning as well as the development of the student. So imagine if you have been asked to design a lesson plan for a diverse classroom. Now understanding these four theories will help you to decide when to use direct instructions, when to facilitate a discovery-based learning activity, and how to incorporate problem-solving tasks. For instance, with associationism, you may be able to guide students to memorize key terms. Constructivism might help you to see how you can design a project, a group project that encourages students to apply what they have learned to the real world. So let's take a look at the first one, that is associationist theory. Now we see that associationist theory is one of the earliest frameworks for understanding how learning occurs. And therefore at its core, this theory posits that learning is the result of forming associations between different stimuli and responses. And therefore, according to this theory, the mind works by connecting ideas, sensations, and experiences that are linked through these associations. And therefore, this process is largely automatic, and it happens through repeated exposure as well as experience. Now, who are the key figures in this method or in this theory? So, we see that first is John Locke. Now, in his work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke argued that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa. In other words, it is a blank slate. And therefore, all knowledge is built from experience. And he emphasized that learning is a process of forming connections between simple ideas that are derived from sensory input. For example, a child learns the concept of warmth by associating the experience of feeling warm with the sensation of sunlight or the fire. So here we see that warmth is in a way associated to either sunlight or fire. Now, David Hume, in a treatise of human nature, he built upon Locke's ideas, proposing that the mind forms associations between ideas through three primary principles, that is resemblance, contiguity, as well as cause and effect. And therefore, he argued that these associations are the basis of all human knowledge and reasoning. For instance, when we see smoke, we immediately think of fire because of the association between the two that have been formed through repeated observation and through our experience. Now, let's take a look at certain principles on which the associationist theory is grounded on. First is the law of contiguity. Now, this basically suggests that learning occurs when two events or two elements are experienced together in close temporal or spatial proximity. So for example, if a stimulus, a bell ringing, is consistently followed by a response, that is food being presented, then we see that one will be able to associate the bell ringing and the food together. So over the time, we see that the sound of the bell alone will trigger the expectation of food. Now, a classic example of this is Pavlov's experiment with dogs. So he rang a bell each time he presented food to the dogs. Eventually, the dogs began to salivate just by listening to the sound of the bell, even if there was no food that was given to them. And therefore, this close temporal pairing, of the bell and the food led to a formation of an association between the two. Next, we have to deal with the law of frequency. Now, the more frequently the two stimuli or stimulus and response occur, then we see that the stronger the association between the two. And therefore here we see that repetition reinforces the connection. And thus it makes it more likely that one will trigger the other one in the future. For example, in language learning, a child hears the word apple repeatedly while seeing an actual apple. Over the time, the frequent pairing of the word and the object strengthens the association, and this enables the child to identify the fruit whenever the word apple is mentioned. Next, we have the law of similarity. Now, according to this principle, we see that stimuli that are similar in nature they tend to be associated with each other. So therefore, when two ideas or experiences resemble each other or are similar to one another, the mind makes a connection between them, and therefore it makes it easier to recall one when the other is encountered. So let's take an example here. If a person learns to associate the sound of the doorbell with someone at the door, or they may also associate similar sounds, for example, the phone ringing with a conversation, even though the stimuli are different. Why? Because we see that the similarity in the sound triggers a similar response. Now the question will be, how can we apply this in the educational setup? So first and foremost, we see that rote memorization involves repeating information multiple times. And this basically leads to formation of a strong association between the information and the recall. For example, we see that students often use flashcards to memorize vocabulary. So in this case, we see that by repeatedly seeing a word and its definition together, they form a strong mental link between the two, therefore enabling easy recall during the tests or during any conversation. So for example, if a student memorizes the multiplication tables by repeatedly reciting them, I'm sure all of us in our childhood, we have done this, where we have repeated the multiplication tables in order to study them by memory. And therefore, over the time, the association becomes so strong that, for example, if you are asked to say what is 3 into 4, without giving it a thought, you know that the answer is 12. So this connection is so strong that immediately you are able to recall the answer without any conscious effort. Next, we see that repetition in learning. Now here we also see that repetition, this reinforces associations. And therefore, this becomes a key strategy in certain educational practices. We see that teachers often use drills or repeated practices to help students to internalize concepts. For example, in maths, we see that repeatedly solving. Okay, so when you solve exercises in maths, it strengthens the association between the problem type and the solution. Similarly, we see that in language, okay, the more you speak, the more familiar you get with the language, and also you tend to learn faster how to associate different words here and there. Just as in maths, you see that by repeatedly solving, you become better at it. So we see that, for example, let's take the example of a musical instrument also. So by repeatedly practicing the scales or repeatedly practicing the chords, we see that a student is able to build muscle memory. And as a result of this, we see that the student need not look at the placement of the chords on the guitar maybe, or even the keys on the keyboard, because the person builds up muscle memory so that without looking, the person is able to play either the guitar, keyboard, or any other musical instrument. Now we see that this kind of theory does have its limitations as well. So one of the major criticisms against this theory is surface learning. So in a way, it does not allow deep understanding. For example, students might be able to recall facts by memorizing them without truly understanding what those concepts really are, or they may not be able to apply them to different contexts. So therefore, in a way, we see that they can't contextualize and apply them to different situations. Next is neglect of cognitive processes. Now we see that associationist theory largely ignores the role of internal cognitive processes. Now which are these? Such as reasoning, problem solving, and critical thinking. And it views learning as a kind of a passive process rather than an active process which involves the construction of knowledge. And then you see that finally there is an overemphasis on repetition. Now therefore, this theory's reliance on continuous repetition can lead to monotonous as well as unengaging learning experiences. It may also fail to account for the importance of motivation, creativity, and individual differences in learning. That means all the students may not have the same level of intelligence, or some may be slow to learn, some may be quick to learn. For some, associating facts, associating ideas may be easier. For others, there may be different techniques. So therefore, this method does not take all those things into consideration. Next is Constructivism. Now, Constructivism as a learning theory, it emphasizes that learners actively construct their own understanding and knowledge of the world through experiences and reflection. So in this way, this emphasizes an active construction of understanding based on one's experiences and reflection. So rather than just absorbing the information, learners now are able to engage with the material. They are able to interpret it based on past knowledge, and at the same time they are also able to build new understanding by connecting the information that they already know. And therefore, this theory emphasizes that learning is an active, personalized process where meaning is constructed, not just received. So here we see that the key figures of this constructivist theory are Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. So Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who is known for his theory of cognitive development. Now he proposed that children move through 4 distinct stages of cognitive development, and each of these is characterized by different ways of thinking and understanding the world. Now, he believed that children are little scientists who actively explore and experiment with their environment, and they construct knowledge through these interactions. So therefore you see children always inquisitive, trying to see what happens if this is done, if that is done. So now what does his stages include? So first stage, he says, is the sensory motor stage. And this is from 0 to 2 years. So here we see that infants learn about the world through senses and actions. Next is the pre-operational stage. This is from 2 to 7 years. And here we see that children begin to use language and symbols, but they lack logical reasoning. The third stage is the concrete operational stage. And this is from 7 to 11 years. And here children start to think logically about concrete events. And then you have the formal operational stage, that is from 12 and beyond. And here we see that adolescents now develop abstract reasoning, as well as hypothetical thinking. For example, a child in the pre-operational stage might believe that a tall, narrow glass holds more water than a short, wide glass, even though they may be holding the same amount of water. It is only through experimentation and observation that the child will eventually learn the concept of conservation, understanding that quantity remains the same despite change in the shape. Now, you have Lev Vygotsky, who was a Russian psychologist, and now he introduces the concept of social constructivism. This emphasizes the fundamental role of social interaction in cognitive development. So he argued that learning is a social process. And knowledge is constructed through collaboration and interaction with others. Now here he speaks about the zone of proximal development. Which refers to the difference between what a learner can do independently and what they can do with guidance. The next is scaffolding. And this refers to the support that is provided by a knowledgeable other. And this knowledgeable other can either be the teacher or it can be one of the peers. And these knowledgeable others helps the learner to perform the tasks they could not do alone. So here we see that gradually, once these knowledgeable others are removed, the learner becomes more competent. So in this way we see that the support is provided and gradually the support is removed as the person becomes more confident in doing things on his own. Just like when we learn the cycle, initially the wheels are there in order to support so that we don't fall. As we learn the art of balancing, slowly those side wheels tend to be removed. Similarly, this also happens in scaffolding. So we see that a child learning to solve puzzles might struggle alone, but he can succeed with hints or guidance from either a parent or a teacher. So as the child becomes more skilled, the helper provides less assistance, allowing the child to take more responsibility for their learning. Now let's take a look at some of the principles that are there in constructivism. So first and foremost, we see there is active learning. So here we see that constructivism views learning as an active process where learners engage with the concept. So they manipulate information, reflect on their experiences. So rather than simply receiving knowledge, here we see that they actively participate. So there is an active participation in the learning process by questioning, experimenting, and also application of what they have learned to various contexts. So for example, in a science class, students might conduct experiments to understand the principles of physics. So rather than just reading about the laws of motions, they actively test these laws through hand-on activities such as rolling different objects down a ramp or observing how their speed and trajectory change. Now, through these activities, students are able to actively construct their understanding of these concepts. Next is the schema. So here schema is in a way a mental framework and this helps to organize as well as structure information. Now, constructivist theories suggest that learners build on existing schemas. That means that as they encounter new information, they already build on what they have already learned. And therefore, here we see that learning would involve modification or creation of schemas to incorporate the new experiences or the new information. Let's take an example. A child may have a schema for a bird that includes characteristics like flies and having feathers. Now, when the child learns about penguins, they must adjust their schema to include birds that cannot fly or that do not fly. And therefore, the process of adapting and refining schemas is a key aspect of learning in constructivism. And next you have the social interaction. So here we see that Vygotsky's social constructivism in a way emphasizes that learning is inherently social and it occurs through interaction as well as collaboration with others. And therefore these others could include teachers, parents, peers, and also more knowledgeable individuals who help learners co-construct the knowledge as they share perspectives, as there is discussion, as you have sharing, and also solving problems together. So basically, when we speak about group learning, it is a kind of a social interaction where learning takes place through your discussions, through your sharing of ideas, opinions with others. So for example, in a classroom, students might work in groups to solve a particular problem, such as designing a solution to reduce plastic waste. And therefore, through their discussion and collaboration, they put together different ideas and build a deeper understanding of the whole issue. And therefore, we see that this social interaction is important for them to understand and construct new knowledge. Now, how do we apply this in the educational setup? So we see that first and foremost you have the project based learning. Now this is an instructional approach where students engage in projects that require them to apply knowledge and skills to solve real world problems. And therefore this approach aligns with the constructivist principles by encouraging active learning, critical thinking, and application of knowledge to different contexts. So for example, in a history class, instead of just reading about ancient civilizations, students might work on a project to create the model of an ancient city. And by doing this, they are now incorporating their research on architecture, culture, and technology. So that means when they are building the model, they will put into practice what they have learned about the street planning, town planning, how the houses were, etc., etc. So in this way, there is a practical application happening of what they have learned, and this helps them to retain that for a longer period of time. And also, therefore, we see that this requires them to synthesize information, also it requires them to make decisions and reflect on what they have learned. Next is the inquiry based learning. Now this basically involves posing questions as well as problems rather than simply presenting established facts. So students engage in exploration, research, as well as experimentation, to discover answers and develop a deeper understanding of the subject matter. For example, in a biology class, students might be asked to investigate the effects of different environmental factors on plant growth. So instead of being given a set of instructions, they formulate their own hypothesis, they make experiments, and they analyze data to draw conclusions. And therefore we see that this process mirrors the scientific method and encourages deep engagement with the material. And next we have the role of teacher as a facilitator. Here we see that the role of the teacher shifts from being a transmitter of knowledge to a facilitator of learning. Now here the teacher provides guidance, resources, as well as support. But students have to take ownership. So students in a way are responsible for their own learning. And therefore the teacher will encourage exploration, by asking questions, and also they help the students to reflect on experiences. So for example, in a literature class, rather than lecturing about the themes of a novel, a teacher might make or facilitate a kind of a discussion where students share their interpretations and analysis. The teacher might also guide the discussion by giving some questions, open-ended questions, which will help the students to think critically and also consider different perspectives. Now here we see that the role of the teacher is only to support and challenge the students as they develop their own understanding of that particular text in the novel. So in this way we see that constructivism is a dynamic and interactive approach to learning, which in a way which will emphasize collaboration, active engagement, and construction of knowledge through experience. And therefore by shifting from passive reception of information to active participation, we see that this gives students more responsibility to take control of their learning and develop a more deeper understanding. But however, we see that this method to be successful, so the success depends upon careful planning. Okay, you need to have appropriate support or scaffolding, and also you need to have a environment that encourages inquiry and collaboration. Okay, so for this class will end till here. Next time around we'll take a look at the problem solving theory as well as the connectionism, which is another learning theory. And then we'll also see how what are the positives and the negatives that all these four learning theories tend to have.